Okay. Are you guys ready to go? Juliet, give me one example of how you think it will lead to World War II.
Because the main point of it was to weaken Germany and its power, causing the government to go into chaos and everybody just going into chaos that lives in Germany.
Okay, so punishment of Germany is going to be a massive factor, right? What are some specific pieces of that that are going to be a problem? Anybody? What are the punishments directed at Germany?
Essentially no army.
Okay, so basically just a National Guard or police force, which is kind of troublesome, especially when you get into the post or interwar years. Like there are a lot of upheaval going on. Like there's a reason we're going to talk about the Weimar Republic today. It's established there instead of Berlin because there were communist groups that were trying to take over in Berlin because like basically civilization kind of bottoms out. And when you have extreme chaos, it tends to lead towards some sort of power vacuum. So that's going to be a problem if you can't control your citizenry and you certainly can't protect yourself from other places. Another specific punishment to Germany that's going to cause massive problems.
The economic, like they had to pay them back.
33 billion, right? It's going to absolutely bankrupt their society. So that's going to be a huge piece of today, looking at the hyperinflation that happened in Germany. And then next week, when we kind of get to the real rise of everything, we're going to talk about how some countries were trying to help. And I'll kind of introduce a little bit about that today. Like countries like America, who weren't as affected by the Germans, who didn't want to punish the Germans, are going to try to find ways to kind of help them with things like the DAWs. So hyperinflation causes massive, massive chaos. One more. Cameron can't talk to somebody else. Thank you, Cameron. What's some of the first thing Hitler does besides the army? Good Lord, let's go.
Am I allowed to talk?
Well, not in theory, no.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Air Force.
Flores, Matt, Carla, Nathan. Land, okay? Land is going to take over areas. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how the French, when they're not getting reparations, are going to kind of take advantage of that. So what you're going to get today is not a super long lecture by any means. Not that many slides. But what the purpose of everything will be is you're going to get this, okay? And this will be what you work on tomorrow. So we're going to try to figure out, well, why did the Weimar Republic fail? And so that's kind of what we're looking at. And not just to Germany, but to like, what was the answer when all of these bad things happened? Because for Germany, it was pretty bad right away. But then when the stock market crashes in the United States, the bottom falls out into what we now call the Great Depression. So we're going to talk about when that happens, how do countries respond? Some will be able to preserve democracy, like England, for example, but yet do some of the same things as far as social programs and things to try to help people. I also want to go ahead and throw this out to you since it's Easter weekend. You can go ahead and make a historical egg if you're dyeing eggs with your family, or not. You can hard boil an egg and turn it into a historical figure for extra credit. The best one out of all my classes gets 10 towards your next test. And if you just try, you get 5. I mean, it has to be more than like a smiley face. But like, I'd be into it if you made it into like a Dadaism egg, if you wanted to do that. But really, I want people. All right, so let's go ahead and look here. So your essential question today, or focus questions, are going to be, what are kind of the issues in the interwar years that are kind of linked to that stuff we've been talking about in this little mini kind of transition unit, talking about the age of anxiety, Great Depression, lead up to the rise of totalitarian states. So I want you to kind of see like in an overlap, right? So this is looking at industrialization, having World War I. We call this time period the interwar period. Okay, so roughly World War II starts, not roughly, exactly September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Hitler. So obviously that's where we're going next week. This whole piece is what we're going to cover today, tomorrow, and like Monday will be appeasement. And we're going to do a little game on Monday called the appeasement game, trying to figure out how to deal with all the stuff that's happening as kind of chaos ensues. I do want you to understand that the 20s were not all bad, okay? And in many ways, people responded the best way they could by trying to suppress a lot of that anxiety and emotional kind of baggage, without other lack of better words, going into this time period, especially in places like Germany. Berlin became very raucous and different. So things that we'll kind of look at today, hence my art deco background. So we'll kind of introduce the rise of totalitarianism today, but that'll be really the focus of next. Okay, so this is kind of just like a get us started, quick little video. Let me have to do the correct share, sorry.
Hi everyone, welcome again to AP European History. My name is Paul Sargent. I got a few minutes that I didn't expect before track practice, so I thought I'd get in a little video here and start talking to you about the period between World War I and World War II. And if you've been following along, you saw that I did spend a lot of time talking about the Treaty of Versailles in the last couple of videos, and it's because I find it to be so very, very, very important. But I also find it important to give an idea going into a unit as to sort of the big picture. Now, spoiler alert, there's a Second World War. I don't know if you knew that or not. Hopefully, if you're in AP European History, you kind of already got that one. But if we look at the period between the wars, we can kind of see a few things happening. And here's going to be the sequence of how these different videos are going to go along. First, we're going to take a look at the period in the 1920s when there's really sort of this uncertainty of how to make this peace work. France is going to spend a lot of time trying to ensure its security, trying to make sure that Germany doesn't invade it again. Germany's going to be struggling with the fact that they have a rather ineffective democracy and that they can't pay all of the money that they were asked to pay at the Treaty of Versailles, and that they're getting punished for not paying that money. And so that's going to cause some problems as we go along. Meanwhile, the United States, that we're not going to cover too much here, is going to completely turn their backs on Europe, except for a little bit financially. And they're going to say, hey, we're just going to deal with our own affairs, and we're going to enjoy the flappers and the roaring 20s, and we're all going to buy stocks. Well, that comes to a crash later on, and I'll get to that. And in Britain, they consistently keep worrying about their empire and securing their sort of dominance of the seas. Now, this is going to all come to an end with two big problems. Number one is the economic collapse of Germany. Germany is going to completely have some real economic problems, and they're horrible. provide a lot of lessons. But the Great Depression provides even more problems. And it leads to a period where people are searching for solutions. In Italy, in Germany, in Russia, and in Spain, those solutions are dictatorial, totalitarian regimes. They're like your absolute monarchs that we studied a long time ago, except these guys are not hereditary, they're not born into it, they're elected into these positions, unless of course you're Stalin, and there's a sort of question of exactly how you got there. You know, but at least with Germany and Italy, we can say you got elected in there in some way, and then you take over and you eliminate all opposition pretty much. This is going to lead to the rearmament of Germany, to the alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan, into the Axis powers, and eventually to Germany's expansion into places where other people don't want them expanding, and ending up in Poland to start the Second World War. So that's kind of the big picture of the whole thing. Along the way, we're also going to look at new changes in thought.
Okay, so we've already done the thought stuff, right? But I just like the way he kind of put things together and laid out, this is where we are, this is where we're going, and kind of the
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
There we go. So, you know, this idea that, you know, we've presented and looking at that age or anxiety piece, which is absolutely important. But in reality, you also have to understand that for a lot of people, the 1920s represented relief, okay? That, okay, we did it, have this massive issue, and now we can move forward. But in reality, we know that that's not true. We know that Europe is not safe and that World War II is there within not even a full generation. So first kind of focus question here, what was the impact of World War I and what problems did Europeans face in the 1920s? And we've kind of been looking at this across looking at all of our age and anxiety issues. But there's this kind of, I think, moment to try to heal a little bit from the tragedy. And that's why some of the writing wasn't as dark and some of the painting wasn't as dark, but almost dreamlike, because you were almost brought into that element of surrealism, right? That what they saw and witnessed was so bad. What is the next? So how do people move forward? Massive, massive cemeteries. And this is kind of a relatively new thing. I want you to kind of understand this, that largely in history, where people were buried was probably the churchyard that they were born to, right? Like that's where most people's burial grounds were. But when you get to these massive wars of some of the imperialism ones or the Franco-Prussian and then into this modern age, it was beyond. So you had to have memorials that look like this for thousands and thousands of dead soldiers. And these go everywhere. And pretty much every society will create what we kind of call the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The United States has one in Arlington National Cemetery. For France, it's at the bottom of the Arc de Triomphe. They have them in London. And it's the recognition that in this First World War, it's beyond comprehension how many people we lost, and we weren't even able to track the death of every single person. So you create a space for missing in action, killed in action that were never able to be identified as just an honor to these people. And remember, we said that France got hit maybe the worst out of all of this. And I think that's why we do see an uptick of kind of a little bit of that bohemian lifestyle in places like Paris, places like Berlin. Because remember how we said this at the first part, and I know it was before break, that like some people responded by wanting more religion, whereas a lot of people started rejecting it a little bit because of everything that they lived through. So here's a little quote from a French woman. No matter how proud as French women we poor mothers may be of our sons, we nevertheless carry wounds in our hearts that nothing can heal. It is strongly contrary to the nature for our children to depart before us. And that whole idea of the lost generation, that idea that you would go into a village in France or a village in Germany, and there's quite literally no men. Like I think we say it, but to really internalize what that means for a society, and therefore makes France very vulnerable to attack when World War II comes around. And then this, right? Because even if they came home and were alive, not only did war make us dead, impotent, or blind, in the midst of beautiful actions of sacrifice and self-abnegation, it also awoke in us ancient instincts of cruelty, barbarity. At times, I who have ne'er punched anyone, who loathes disorder and brutality, to pleasure in killing. There's something breaking of a soul. We now would call it like PTSD or something like that. It's not normal to kill another person. It does bring about something that is harder to fix than fixing a wound on a body. These are the things that are there. And one could argue that a lot of the leaders of World War II bore those from World War I. There is definitely something that is barbaric of Hitler and that was cultivated in him from fighting in World War I, and then the people he surrounds himself with. So this is where we were with your bell work, right? It's just a complete failure. They walk away with all the punishment, and of course it's going to get carried out. But there was no way that Germany could do it. There's absolutely no way that they could meet that. And so you have people leaving really angry, even the French, because they asked for all of this, payback and whatnot, and it's not going to happen because literally Germany can't do it. So instead of trying to go, okay, maybe we need to rethink the reparations, France doubled down on it. And so I want you to look right here, okay? So 1922, several years after Versailles is finished, and you really see the implementation of all the punishments. And they occupied an industrial section of the Ruhr Valley. They said, okay, if you're not going to pay us, we're just going to take this land from you. Guess what? Remember Alsace, Lorraine, and the Rhineland, that ping pong ball of history, right? They got chunks of it back from the treaty, but then there were other parts further in that were German land, as by the Treaty of Versailles. And they said, you're violating the Treaty of Versailles because you're not paying us. So we will occupy this industrial rich sector, and we will take from what you make. And we will take that to us, and we'll count that towards your 33 billion. And so this is going to lead to even more anger, more resentment by the German populace. So when there becomes a guy that's coming in saying, if we do this, we can, reinstate our power, why not listen to him? Why not follow him? Can anybody guess what's going on in this picture? Or these two pictures?
They're like wearing and stacking tons of money because there's just too much of it.
What money?
Deutschmarks?
Reichmarks. Yeah, good try. Yeah, so the mark, Deutschmarks, yeah, you're probably right, actually. Maybe it's said in two different ways. So when you get to this early 1920s period, 130 billion marks equals $1. So what's the point in it? It's worth nothing. So I might as well drink some champagne in my Marx dress with my Marx hat and celebrate how awful things are. You gotta kind of love that mentality a little bit of these people. Let's go ahead and wallpaper the bedroom with it. Let's go ahead and light fires with it because it is essentially worthless. So this really, it really is going to do so much to ruin the Germans. And America is going to try to answer this because nobody else is still going to do it. Because guess what? France and England, they have to pay back a bunch of money to the United States. Now, the United States in the 20s is doing really well. So roaring 20s, lots of wealth being created. But we're going to insert ourselves into that because of the wealth issue. Okay, so at Treaty of Versailles, you had the Locarno Pact. And this was the kind of solidifying of the new borders, like they're drawn up. So it kind of forces the specific regions to completely say whose is what. And so once that was done and they finally agreed to it, Germany actually was able to join the League of Nations in 1926. So some people had hoped that with this, okay, maybe Europe could become truly fixed, okay? So here's your other stone right here, the Dawes Plan. Do I not have a, you know what, hold on 1 second, I'm gonna grab it. We learn it next year. Let me just throw it in there real fast. There's the second. So entirely, America didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, we looked at that political cartoon on your test, right? They were the keystone to probably making it truly work with the League of Nations. We even created the League of Nations, and then we walked away from it because the United States decided we're going to become isolationists. So when you get to 1924, it becomes obvious with the hyperinflation that Germany is never going to be able to pay back the money to England and France. The United States was supposed to be getting $2.5 billion from allied nations, largely France and England. So in our Congress, they decided to create the Dawes Plan. And essentially, the United States loaned money to Germany, and they used that money to, some of it obviously, to work within their country, and then also send the money back to the Allies to stabilize or lower the hyperinflation that the Germans were experiencing. Does this help? Yes. Does it fix the problem? No. But it's interesting to see that the only reason that the United States comes in is because of an economic incentive, okay? However, obviously, the Allies could have realized that the reparations were inappropriate and tried to figure out something else. So that's why you have that little rock of Europe trying to not have any big issues. So I kind of want to make sure you see that the 1920s was largely a good and happy time in a lot of Europe. Even though there is the anxiety, even though there's the hurt of World War I, many people felt like things were going in a right direction, especially if you lived in places like France, like England, like Belgium, and they were recovering, okay? And industry was doing well, they defeated the Huns, this is good. And so you had the Jazz Age, you had the opulence, you had a lot of those pieces, but one could also argue that the Jazz Age was a manifestation of the angst of a little bit of what they were feeling, especially in places like Berlin, where jazz became very cool. And there were generational conflicts around this new culture because it was very sexually expressive. There were drugs, there was drinking. So the 1920s is a very turbulent decade that is going to be very difficult for like the new government of Germany, where we're headed here in a couple slides. It was harder for them to kind of unify their people around this new democracy. So let's get to 1929. Okay, so October 29th, 1929, the United States stock market crashes. Okay, so in one day, essentially 13 million stocks were sold. So companies that were vibrant and healthy in the morning, by the afternoon, were completely tanked. So let's say this, what is a stock? What is that?
It's like a part of a company that you buy.
Okay, and so it's helpful when you're trying to create a healthier economy, in the sense that, okay, I have an idea and I have only X amount of money to make this business into something big, but if I can publicly trade it, people can invest in my company, and then I can grow my company, maybe create more jobs because of it, make a larger, better factory because of it. And then when I have success, I pay back my people that invested me at a higher rate. For a lot of reasons, the US stock market crashes. There's a big crisis with farmers because throughout World War I, the United States farmer was asked to make a ton of food to basically feed the Allies. And then when war came to a screeching halt, they were left with debt because they'd gone into debt to buy more land, buy a new tractor. And that had destabilized the banking industry in the United States. Other things like the steel industry weren't making as much money anymore. The average American, although wealth was going well in the 20s, was largely going only to the top percentages. So the average American was actually not increasing their pay with the cost of living. So by the time we get to 1929, when this panic sets in, that the value of the American dollar is not actually where it's at, it causes hysteria at the stock market, New York Stock Exchange, and that 13 billion are sold in that single day. So when you look here, this causes a massive ripple effect worldwide. Okay. So I know some of you said you watched the Peaky Blinders, which is probably not appropriate for you, but it's a great show. And there's part of, I think, season like 3 maybe, where one of the characters is off in America making business interests for this gang from Birmingham, England. So one of those industrial cities like Manchester. And he gets a call and he's like, we lost all of the money. And the head of the gang organization, the Peaky Blinders, is like, what do you mean you lost everything? Like, well, we had a bunch of money in the stock market and literally it's done, it's gone. And this sends kind of a really important piece here. This piece, Americans' investment is largely in Europe. So now if that money of the DAWs, done, can't send it, right? Money from American banking that was maybe propping up some businesses in Germany, gone, done. So whatever lifeline was coming from America into Germany, the bottom falls out, okay? And I want you to kind of keep this in mind. At the beginning of the 1920s, before the Dawes Plan helped kind of settle some things, Hitler and his buddies tried to take over the country. Anybody remember what that was called? His failed attempt? Nobody remembers this?
It was like the Night of Tears, something like that.
Oh, you're thinking Night of Broken Glass. That's Holocaust stuff. No, go ahead.
It was beer hall. I can't remember.
Yep, beer hall foods, where him and his buddies that were the Nazis tried to overthrow the government in Munich because they were hoping to take over southern Germany first and then all of Germany to create the National Socialist Workers' Party or the Nazis. He failed. Him and his stormtroopers, they created their own militia. In many ways, you can think of like, it's not exact here, but January 6th, when the people tried to take over Congress and make them do something, it's the same sort of idea. It failed, and those people got put in prison because of it, okay? And while he's there, he writes Mein Kampf, right? And of course, we're going to review all this. But I want to point out that, like, he comes out in 1929, and, like, the world gets turned upside down entirely. So this guy who's kind of been like kind of a nobody unless you were from like the Munich area now becomes somebody in a situation that is much worse than when he went to prison. And so you're going to talk about that kind of, even if maybe like pathos of that like why do people flock to and listen to this crazed man? So obviously the lady's lighting a fire there also. So there are choices to be made when the Great Depression hits. How do you fix it? This is going to be very indicative of where their country goes in the near future. Okay, so let's start here, France. Okay, it was very scary. In most countries, there was a fear that like the Russian Revolution could end up happening because so much poverty hits people so fast. So for example, in the United States, 1 in 4 people are out of a job, 25% unemployment. People were losing homes. People were losing farms that had been in families for centuries. So what do? Okay, let's look right here. The French New Deal. So from this time frame right ahead, they have a little bit of political chaos. So everybody kind of has this, where they go through upheaval. Kind of like, oh God, everything's hit the fan. What do we do? Okay. So you have people that are like pro-democracy. You have some that are more socialist, some that are pro-communist. And so essentially, it's like a political face-off. And who comes out on top is this guy, Leon Blum, who's pro-democracy, but pro-socialist order, okay? So remember how we said the growth of the nation state in our last unit was that idea that the state needs to provide in order to create a more stable society for their citizens, and therefore you can cut off more issues easier. So this is kind of what they do here. They institute things like a 40-hour work week, paid vacation, minimum wage, and the government comes in and will create jobs and use deficit spending and programs to help people, meaning making sure they don't lose their homes, getting them food. These are all things that the French are going to do. Great Britain. So he said in his intro thing, right, that a big problem for the British is, can we hang on to our empire? Because they're going to lose track of Ireland, right, during that time frame. So what do? A lot of austerity, and you have the rise of more modern parties in their society to start. Okay, so I want you to kind of see this. You had two dueling sides. You had the Labour Party, which tended to be more liberal, and then the Conservative Party. And so when these people start in, they're going to do some things called, we're going to basically stop spending money, and some of their social programs started failing. Okay. So they're going to kind of mirror a little bit about what the United States looked like at the very beginning of the Great Depression until 1932. So from 1928 to 1932, Herbert Hoover was president, and he believed in true conservatism that the government should not help. The government should not intercede. He loses to Franklin Roosevelt, and we deeply become a different country after that. You see a similar thing play out in England, and it had a lot to do with this economist. Okay, so I want to nail this one with you guys. So I'm going to take a second here. Make sure you write his name entirely. John Maynard Keynes. Okay. His theories are going to become known as, I hope I spell this correctly, Keynesian economics. Okay. What he said is that demand side economics actually creates a healthier economy. And that's going to go directly against the conservative ideology that the early part of the 30s for the British and the United States followed. Okay, so the British and the Americans are going to follow something called supply side economics throughout the 1920s, meaning you lower taxes and therefore decrease as well what you're giving to the people. Okay, with hopes that the people at the top with the money are going to invest back into your society. John Maynard Keynes is going to directly question that, and it revolutionizes what the socialist type state looks like. And when I say socialist, I want not Nazi Socialist Workers' Party, okay? What we've already talked about with the ism, where the state supplies more to the people through programs. So he said the better choice, especially in this economic crisis, is to provide funds to the bottom of your society. And it can go to all, but it's really going to benefit the bottom, people that are losing their homes, people that are losing jobs. And so it's either your government creates jobs, your government literally gives direct funds to those people, and then they become spenders with that money so they can pay for their rent, buy clothes, and it helps stimulate the economy, okay? So both of them are going to take on that idea in Great Britain, and actually Hitler will do the same when he finally gets power, something I'll talk about. Does that make sense? So this New Deal you see across the board for a lot of countries, where you're starting to develop and craft more ways and increase the role that the national government has in the lives of its citizens. Okay? So let's look at a couple things right here. And let's define this, because it'll be really important at the end of World War II. So largely, these things like the New Deal, Keynesian economics, New Deal, created what we call the welfare state. Welfare capitalism is when a private company decides to give more to their employees so that they become maybe wealthier and more stable consumers. This comes at the choice of a business. Welfare state is when the country decides to give more money to the poorer people. Maybe that's through direct funds like welfare, creating jobs, providing homes. And then through that, they become earners and you have a larger consumer state. And that is directly linked to Keynesian economics. So the growth of the welfare state, an example in the United States would be Social Security. England will do it at the same time. So will France. They recognize in a Great Depression, if you're 75 years old, you probably can't go work in a factory. So they created kind of what we call safety nets for more vulnerable people that are older. That's a great example of a welfare state. So those people hadn't paid into it. You and I will spend all of our paychecks in our adult lives or even kid lives creating that for when we retire. Almost on everyone. So who was the best Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark? And I guess we didn't say Iceland as well. But these countries used entirely much more social democracy. The things and choices that they make here are going to be mirrored by a lot of the other countries in the post-World War II years. So the larger growth of states, high taxes, many more things coming from the government to the people, and they actually were able to increase wages in the 1930s. So they took Keynesian economics and made it almost beyond what Keynes ever thought. They created much more from the state to the people and increased taxes in order to pay for it. And it created a very stable economy in the interwar years. Really, the only one that was really good in the 1930s were in these countries. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to stop for a second. What now, knowing that we know what happened to Germany and we know with all the hyperinflation, how is that going to make totalitarianism more likely to happen in many more states? The Great Depression. Why will the Great Depression make it more likely for the rise of dictators? Come on, somebody. Miller, what do you got?
Like the leaders can promise job and economic security.
So because of that bad and chaos, you're willing to give up the other pieces, right? Because totalitarianism takes away a lot of your freedoms. So in England, you don't really have to lose a lot of your freedoms. Maybe you pay more in taxes, maybe the government has a little bit more control, but they're able to stabilize over time. In Germany, they get led by a megalomaniac like Hitler, and he's able to take it into a completely different direction. Does that make sense? This is kind of what I want you to see next as we transition over into the next last piece here. Okay. So what did they do? How did they deal with the interwar years, especially looking at the rise of dictatorships? And this will be much more what we do on Monday. Okay. Just remember, in these places, not only do you have economic problems, how do you support the veterans of the First World War that were the walking wounded? Quite literally. So this is Germany. This is the focus of today, right? The Weimar Republic. So I mentioned this to you guys in the beginning. This was created in Weimar, Germany, actually a small town, because Berlin was in chaos in the post-war years. There were communists, there were monarchists. It's like the isms, and it was just a little too hot to put the seat of government in that place. So they went to Weimar, more south, more stable, to create this new democratic state. And I want to point out, they could not surrender without agreeing to be creating a democratic country in the post-war years. So at first, the Kaiser was refusing, and his upper officers were like, I don't really care anymore. You need to abdicate the throne. And so he did. Okay. So when the armistice of November 11th, when they decide, the Weimar Republic was essentially going to occur. Okay. So in it, it's very similar to what, say, the government of England looks like, except there's no monarchy. Okay, so it's much more of a parliamentarian idea because you have two heads of state, a president and a chancellor. You have a judiciary system, and then you have a legislative branch, which is the Reichstag. Okay, so in that, when they walked away from Versailles, this is what is going to be created for Germany. However, sounds great. Democracy. We all know that that's the better choice. But they are basically handed, here's an absolute disaster. Please go ahead and fix it. Go create a modern country using democracy. Well, if we notice in the 1930s, every other country, although they may have maintained their democracy, they increased the role of the government in people's lives. So it wasn't necessarily a good thing that they went straight into this, although it is the best, obviously. To navigate how bad things were, it was almost like it was doomed to fail. And I wouldn't say it was inevitable, but pretty much because of specifically the economic issues that were facing Germany. So could you imagine being the first president or chancellor and you get to have hyperinflation, depression in all business elements, conflict of where to go next. So you have the communists and the socialists and the monarchists and the conservatives all fighting each other. There's an underlying current of racism and anti-Semitism because people want to blame somebody. There's this issue of how much power should the Catholic Church have in southern Germany, the Protestant Church in northern, should that have no influence at all, which is also going to be an issue. So in total, it's only going to last for 14 years. Okay. But the real critical time happens when the Great Depression hit. So I'm saying that from, 1920 until 1929, it wasn't a walk in the park, but they were working. They were handling it. They were mostly surviving. But I want you to look at this as proof that after the Great Depression, they're done. 1928, there were 12 elected Nazis in the Reichstag. 1930, 107. This is showing us that in a small time frame, more and more people were willing to elect the National Socialist Workers' Party into positions of power, okay, including its anti-Semitic rhetoric, because they were offering solutions to the problems that were hitting the German people, okay? So this is the Weimar Republic. So like I said, president, most powerful, chancellor, chancellor of the ministry. So this kind of thing, this is like the cabinet members. And so both of the executive branches have that. Then you have your Congress and then your judiciary. And the judiciary was not very modern. And this was another area of the Weimar Republic that failed as far as trying to create stability and kind of bring authority to the government. So here's a little bit on them.
There are many words that people use to describe the Weimar Republic, but successful isn't often one of them. It was plagued from the very start with immense political instability, economic problems, as well as international isolation. Long story short, it wasn't very fun. In the end, a mere 14 years after its creation, it was superseded by the Third Reich. Now obviously it was the new government that brought an end to the Weimar Republic, but why was Mr. Mustache voted into office and what conditions led to so many Germans giving up on it and seeking an alternative? And just so we get this out the way, the Weimar Republic wasn't the country's official name, it was still formally known as the Deutsches Reich. So a quick overview of how the Republic came into creation. Germany was on the cusp of losing the First World War and the Kaiser fled the country, declaring his intention to abdicate. A coalition of left-wing politicians, mostly from the Social Democratic Party, declared in the town of Weimar the creation of a republic, which upset mostly everyone. And included within the term everyone were the communists, who were at this point trying to instigate communist revolution because that's kind of their thing. Afraid of communist revolution, the Social Democratic Party teamed up with right-wing paramilitary groups like the Freikorps to stop them. So the Weimar Republic didn't actually fail until 1933, but the events in the decade before are important to understanding why the German people disliked it. Germany didn't have a long democratic tradition like, say, the USA, and so the people weren't fiercely loyal to the concept of democracy itself, and many simply wanted security and prosperity. This, combined with Germany's humiliations in the wake of World War I or the hyperinflation crisis following 1921, meant that the German people just wanted stability. And to be clear, the role of the economic downturns in the fall of the Weimar Republic is hard to underestimate. Since many Germans were genuinely impoverished, and when the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic failed to relieve the issues, it's unsurprising that people turned to any alternative they could, which caused more problems for the ruling politicians because of the voting system in place. This system was proportional representation, which, to simplify, allocated the seats in the German parliament based upon the national proportion of votes that parties achieved in elections. Since the German public was highly divided on pretty much everything, no party was ever going to get more than 50% of the votes, and so parties had to form coalitions, but it wasn't long before even this proved impossible. And this, in case you're wondering, is why the Communist Party struggled to gain power, because they wholeheartedly refused to work under any circumstances with the largest party. Furthermore, those running the Republic weren't exactly enamoured with the idea of democracy. Right-wing political parties often rallied against the Republic, and many, at least initially, wished for the return of the Kaiser. And it was these combined factors, economic problems, political polarisation, a fairly prevalent disdain for democracy, and international weakness that severely undermined the Republic. The lack of stable majority also meant that whatever new issues arose, there was little ability to fix them without a lot of squabbling. In fact, the only way of getting anything done was to use the president's executive powers, which could be increased during emergencies. Thus, it shouldn't be surprising that when one party whose side hadn't relinquished the initiative stepped forward and presented a new idea, it became popular fairly quickly. They denounced the idea that Germany was guilty of causing World War I, gave Germans a scapegoat for their loss, promised an end to the political squabbling, and reunify the fractious German nation. The Weimar Republic's failure shouldn't be seen as inevitable. It was the perfect storm of factors that broke the Republic, and had one or two of these factors not been present, it may well have survived. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, with thanks to my Patreon supporters whom you can see on screen now. There are many words that...
So this is where we'll go next week, and this is what your assignment will be about, is how did they get from democracy to that? So from that short little video, do you think the Weimar Republic was inevitable to fail? Do you think they could have fixed it? If Hitler didn't come along, do you think that they could have survived? Trinity, what do you got?
I mean, I guess it could have probably survived, but also there's, people were so weak at the time that if it stopped working, they would have been really quick to go against it.
Yeah, and I think a really good point to obviously the economic issues is the fact that they had so many political elements all kind of butting heads that it was difficult to necessarily do what was right for people. And therefore, if there's a definitive type of party that is seemingly able to pull together and create a coalition that's creating better change, you may look the other way from something that was scary like the anti-Semitism or element, like you maybe you didn't have a terrible thought in your body for Jewish people, but you allowed them to take power because you thought economically they were going to help you. Okay. And the problem is when authoritarian regimes take over, especially if they're nefarious, by the time you want to stop them, you really can't. Okay. And so we'll review that next week. And I know that you'll remember how Hitler gets elected, right? He gets the Enabling Act passed where they're like, don't worry about that whole constitution for 4 years, just fix the country. And he's like, cool, here's the government, done. We don't need a Congress, we don't need a Reichstag. And now it's a complete totalitarian state, okay? So again, this should be very, very obvious, and this is stuff that we're gonna go through obviously next week, but totalitarianism takes root in many countries because they're all grappling with how to fix this economic calamity. And so again, the United States, Great Britain, France, they're using the New Deal. And it has elements of totalitarianism in it, but really more like social democracy, okay? And that's why Scandinavia was much better at it. However, these countries are going to institute dictators and authoritarian regimes all surrounding some ism, whether that's Nazism, fascism, communism, okay? Fascism is really all of them because it's glorifying the state above the individual. So therefore, I give up some of my private freedoms, personal freedoms, so that more people in my country can eat, so that I can eat, that the economy is stabilized. So don't worry about writing these things down because we're going to spend a whole day on just totalitarianism, and I'm sure you remember this. It's hard to have totalitarianism without a dynamic leader, okay? Mussolini knew what he was doing. Great speaker. Hitler was very good. They knew what they were doing. Something used symbolic, uses a lot of patriotic words, sets goals, glorifies. The Third Reich will be as good as the Romans were. Okay? Mussolini, we will be as good as the Romans were. Building upon some sort of unifying goal that everyone's like, yeah, I like that. Okay? But in that one party rule, so you eliminate opposition, you have massive uses of terror by eliminating the opposition, usually by force, with concentration camps, by killing them, by censoring them. And then the state runs everything. And I want to think about it this way too. It's not like the state runs the education that I teach you, right? And to a degree, it has some oversight what I teach you. But here's your word problem for the day, children. How many bombs would it take to burn up this entire Jewish city to the ground? So it was a math problem, but it was infiltrated with propaganda for the greater part of the entire Nazi state, which was the cultivation of racism and anti-Semitism against Jewish people. So it's a totally different thing from the social democratic version of control of your institutions within society. Do not write all this stuff down yet, but this is where we're going to go next week. So it can look in different ways. You have the communists, which is left wing, meaning it's more allegedly egalitarian and better for the working class and lower class people, rooted in the economic belief of communism. So the Soviet Union is an authoritarian fascist state with an economic theory surrounding communism. Germany is going to be an authoritarian, totalitarian state all around socialism. So it still has elements that link each other, but it tends more to do of a conservative rhetoric. It'll be about tradition. That's why you didn't listen to jazz once Hitler came to power. That would have been forbidden. But you can listen to Richard Wagner because he's a great German artist. So these are the big three, obviously, that we'll review and look at. But really, we'll be focusing on those three, but we'll also talk about Spain as well. Okay? So do not write this down, but I want you to see how almost all of them, these two get elected. This one kind of declares himself and takes over the city. Here's your isms. There's your leaders. They had their own military and militias. They eliminated opposition. They had secret police. Okay. And they almost all had youth organizations to indoctrinate the next group of children. And Versailles and that war guilt clause will be another massive piece of why the Weimar Republic failed. One thing they can all agree on in Germany is that the Treaty of Versailles was crap and that the punishment of the German people was essentially wrong, okay? And they're not alone. There are other countries that are going to lean towards and create and elect dictators because of things that happened to them at Versailles. For example, the Treaty of Trianon is an offshoot of the Treaty of Versailles. So this is like, okay, we made all the big decisions. Then they made smaller ones to deal with the other elements of the Central Powers. So they split up Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary being one of them. This is all the loss of land that will happen to those people. Okay, so creation of Czechoslovakia, creation of Yugoslavia. Let me show you this next slide. The Hungarian or Magyar people are now being cut up and sent to all these different sectors. Okay, and so it's not just the Germans that are going to be mad. And here's the thing about borders. Borders don't actually necessarily define a people, especially when borders are created arbitrarily at the end of a war. So by the time you get to the eve of World War II, there are many dictatorships throughout Europe because totalitarian states make sense essentially for trying to get yourself out of the sticky situation that is the Great Depression. Now, of course, they'll all lose, right? Because Soviet Union and Germany will all fight for this corridor pretty badly. Spain will stay out of it altogether. Francisco Franco will keep himself out and keep that dictatorship till the 1970s. So essentially, when we're starting to look at the causes of World War II, this is what we looked at today: Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression. Next week, we'll look at, well, we talked a little bit about this, but we'll talk more about it next week: aggression of Japan, aggression of Italy, the rise of Hitler's Germany, and then this is the big one: appeasement, okay? Which will all get us to the terrible tragedy that is World War II. Okay, so I have a John Green for you, which I think is about perfect timing. Tomorrow is your DBQ, and you'll have plenty of time to work on that.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So despite improvement in living conditions across much of Europe after 1925, wartime resentments and disruption lingered, and then a momentous event in 1929 gradually turned into a wide-ranging disaster. In that year, the U.S. stock market crashed. What came after is known as the Great Depression, and today we're going to talk about how that impacted Europe and how it coincided with the rise of dictators in Europe. The stock market crash came after several years of U.S. citizens enthusiastically playing the market with borrowed money, and commentators had fueled the rise in stock prices by saying that the stock market was on a permanently high plateau, implying that prices could never fall, so borrowing money to buy stocks was a sure thing. Listen, I'm not a financial advisor, so take this with a grain of salt, but when people start saying that buying stocks is a sure thing, it ain't. You can't time the market, and there are no sure things, except for death. Even taxes are not a sure thing. Just ask Amazon. Anyway, having made a ton of money while Europeans were bankrupting themselves in World War I, the United States had become a huge source of loans for financing post-war recovery in Europe and elsewhere, as well as agricultural and industrial modernization and the creation of new businesses. But as the stock market dropped, bankers began demanding payment for loans that had been used to buy stocks or invest in major projects, including international ones, and in many cases, those loans could not be paid back, which caused banks to fail. Businesses also failed as consumers had less money to make purchases and workers lost jobs by the millions. When the economy is working, its virtuous cycles seem endless, and when the economy stops working, its vicious cycles also seem endless. And by 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed. That was 1/3 of the total workforce. In terms of keeping their jobs, women were actually sometimes better off than men, but only because they received drastically lower wages, and so single women at least were less likely to be laid off. It was men who came to epitomize the unemployed. Adolf Hitler, like Benito Mussolini, said he wanted to restore not just the reputation of his country, but the war-shattered masculinity of the individual man. Hard times further undermined that sense of strong and secure manhood, but stormtroopers felt they were reviving German masculinity by marching through neighborhoods and beating up communists and Jewish people. Their violence also discredited the democratically run Weimar Republic, which couldn't keep order, and Nazis did employ men via this paramilitary organization, the kind of jobs that the Weimar Republic seemed unable to create. Of course, this is ultimately an example of only solving problems that you yourself have created, a long-standing tradition in authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, youth were flocking to Joseph Stalin as they did in Germany to Hitler. By 1929, Stalin had consolidated his power in part by bringing thousands of new people to serve in the post-Lenin government at the local, regional, and national level. But the Soviets had big problems, beginning with food scarcity, even though it contained huge amounts of of fertile land. Stalin put the blame on kulaks, or well-to-do peasants, which was an extension of Lenin's demonization of kulaks. Lenin once ordered, "Hang, absolutely hang, in full view of the people, no fewer than 100 known kulaks." Lenin ordered many such killings, actually, and believed ongoing violence was essential to revolution, a practice that Stalin dramatically expanded. So in Russian, kulak means fist, and for communists, the property-owning kulaks held communism in their greedy grip by hiding surplus crops from the government. So Stalin roused Soviet youth to a war on kulaks, calling them enemies wedded to individualism and personal wealth. However, as with Nazism, neighbors often denounced anyone whose property they coveted. In Germany, Hitler built unity among his followers by pointing to the false worldwide Jewish conspiracy that supposedly had one goal: the annihilation of the Aryan race. And likewise, Stalin continued the Bolshevik trend of slaughtering supposed enemies of the people, in this case, the, quote, bloodsuckers, cattle, swine, loathsome, repulsive kulaks. They had no souls. They stank, as one Soviet citizen recalled in his memoirs. In both cases, the dehumanization of the other was profound. I mean, you can see it in that quote, actually, as people are not called people, but cattle and swine without souls. But Stalin's goal was not only to fortify communism through the murder of enemies, he also wanted to reorganize the agricultural economy by seizing individual farms and converting them into collective farms that would replace private ownership. And Ukraine was one of the major agricultural regions of the USSR, which made Ukrainians especially vulnerable to the widespread violence of the Stalin regime. Rebelling against the murder and oppression of their friends and neighbors, individual farmers sometimes even slaughtered livestock and destroyed crops. But the execution and persecution of kulaks, friends of kulaks, and anyone else against whom there were grudges did nothing to increase agricultural productivity. In fact, the communalization of farms lowered yields and caused a famine. In total, Stalin's purges and the resulting famine likely resulted in at least 10 million deaths by the mid-1930s. And then Stalin turned to other elements in the population to purge. As famine unfolded, communist leaders needed to find more enemies to blame for it, this time Bolsheviks themselves, both high and low, as well as the military, many of whom confessed in their show trials after having been tortured for days. Some faithful friends of Stalin even admitted to having disloyal thoughts, if not deeds, which was adequate sin to justify execution. On the eve of his death, one old Bolshevik thanked Stalin for devising, quote, the great and bold political idea behind the general purge, which speaks to how deeply propaganda can work on humans. He had entire cities built around new factories and mining operations. For instance, with the assistance of US and German consultants, the city of Magnitogorsk became the center of Soviet steel production. The government summoned workers, both men and women, from across the vast Soviet lands to work there and in other factories. The living conditions were often terrible, the working conditions difficult or even lethal. Yet, as one woman lathe operator explained proudly, we mastered this new profession, completely new to us, with great pleasure. And to many, both inside the USSR and outside of it, this was a utopia in the making. Idealists from all over the world flocked to what promised to be a wonderland of egalitarian achievement. And it's important to note that Hitler also attracted many admirers from outside of Germany, such as industrialist Henry Ford and aviator Charles Lindbergh in the United States. Which brings us back to Germany. In the fall of 1932, elections in Germany saw the communists and the Nazis receive similarly strong support, although the Nazis actually lost a few seats in that election. But afterwards, conservative leaders persuaded President Hindenburg, for whom, incidentally, history's most disastrous airship was named, to appoint Hitler chancellor. The theory was that Hitler would be easier to control than the communists, but with the backing of his passionate supporters, Hitler began to dismantle Germany's democratic system, which at that point had really only existed for a bit more than a decade. Through intimidation and brutal treatment of elected representatives, Hitler soon passed an enabling act that allowed him virtually unchecked power. I mean, rarely has an act been more aptly named than the Enabling Act. He then moved in many directions in order to create a people's community, or Volksgemeinschaft. He had a protection squad created, the SS, that rounded up dissenters or anyone not seen as meeting Nazis' standards of proper Germanness, Ways of not being properly German included being Jewish, being gay, being a communist, or being of Roma ancestry, among many others. The SS had vast powers to imprison so-called enemies in concentration camps or to execute them. In the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, Hitler's forces massacred hundreds of Nazis who had called for a restoration of Nazi purity by ending alliances with businessmen and the military elite. That massacre purged the so-called socialist or anti-elitist element in the original party in order to emphasize German nationalism alone. Nazis held massive book burnings, Nazi youth groups built loyalty from an early age, and it became common for young Nazis to turn in anyone who uttered criticism of the regime, including their own parents and other relatives. Alongside arrests and purges, Nazi policy turned to deficit financing to build infrastructure, such as modern highways that would put men back to work. By 1936, fewer than 1.6 million men were still unemployed. Hitler justified these deficits by saying he would pay for them via future conquests. The Nazis were also concerned with reversing population decline, so they instituted loans for couples giving birth to babies that were deemed pure Aryans, with the wife agreeing to surrender her employment as part of the deal. Birth control and abortion were forbidden to women deemed to be Aryan, but they were readily available to those who the Nazis considered inferior. And then, in the 1930s, foreshadowing broader policies, the government began to murder physically or mentally disabled people in mobile gas chambers that traveled to hospitals and other institutions. The aim was the creation of a master race purged of purportedly inferior types, such as Roma, Slavs, and above all, Jewish people, whose supposed inferiority, in Hitler's word, was documented by the greatest of scientific knowledge. We've talked before about negative integration and positive integration techniques for building a community. Positive integration techniques involve celebrating shared values and finding a definition for what we are. Negative integration techniques involve defining a community by what we aren't, especially by finding enemies or targeting outsiders to unify a community. In Hitler's Germany, the population coalesced into a Volksgemeinschaft by a shared dehumanization and shared hatred of outsiders, especially Jewish people. German feelings of worth and even superiority were restored and strengthened by hating others. And this was a long-term and very public practice that people both inside of Germany and outside of it knew about. For instance, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 removed Jewish people's German citizenship and barred them from most jobs and from marriage to Aryans. The government moved Jews from their housing, reduced the food they were allowed, and forced them to work at lowly jobs for virtually no pay. Officials and neighbors then stole Jewish housing and personal property, showing that Nazi claims to high ideals masked outright theft and greed. Jewish people first suffered what historians call a social death, as their lives were degraded by the Nazis, making any harm that might come to them appear natural. Indeed, so-called social death often precedes widespread murder. In 1938, the son of a harassed Jewish couple killed an official, which the Nazis used as an excuse for a rampage against synagogues, businesses, homes, and individuals, a horrific event that came to be known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Nazi regime rampaged and plundered internationally as well. In 1935, Germany began openly boosting military power, which had been curtailed by the Versailles Treaty. In 1936, German troops occupied the Rhineland, an area in western Germany bordering France. In 1938, Germany occupied Austria to cheering crowds, and then absorbed Austria into the Reich, which was forbidden by the Peace of Paris.
Okay, so tomorrow I'll be about the DBQ and why it failed. So I hope that I gave you enough stuff. And so remember that this is what we'll be working on. So before you write, I want you to hip each thing. So I expect you to work together and we'll hip each document and then create and answer the question. Analyze the factors that contributed to the instability of the Weimar Republic between 1918 to 1933. Okay? And then we're off into World War II. Bye, Trace. Okay, I'll see you guys.